Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Brian Vecchi, technical evangelist for Varonis. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing well. Thank you, John.
You pick up a newspaper, you go online, and you find out that cybersecurity is now a matter of national security. It's all over the place. And the guy I never quote, but I have to quote today, is Warren Buffett. And he recently said that cyber attacks are a bigger threat than nuclear weapons. Wow.
Yeah, it's not surprising. Every organization has data and information. And unlike in the past where we thought of technical assets as being replaceable, you can replace a laptop, you can replace a server, you can replace technology or even pieces of the network. The data is really an organizational, in this case, a federal or an agency or a business asset. The data has real value, and it's becoming far too easy for attackers to get a hold of that information, hold it hostage in the case of ransomware, or just exfiltrate it and make use of it for their own purposes.
Infiltrate, exfiltrate. Sounds like a spy movie here or something, doesn't it?
It is. We're talking about attacks. We're talking about sophisticated attackers getting into technical networks, getting access to data, and exfiltrating that data. We're talking about ingress to systems and egress of that data, or denial of service of that data in the case of ransomware.
Well, let's dial it back a little bit and talk about human beings, because human beings are prone to make mistakes. And
Sure.
there's a group called CERT, and I do quote them a lot, and they report that insider threats can be intentional and unintentional. And I left the back door open, Janet. One of those things, huh?
Sure. Insider threat refers to anybody that's already inside the network. Organizations for years have spent all of their time and energy just trying to build bigger and stronger fences to keep people out, not realizing that the real danger, or many of the real dangers, are already inside their network. Users have access to far too much data. We recently studied thousands of the data risk assessments that we do for some of our customers, and we found that 47% of the customers that we talked to had more than 1,000 files open to everybody in the company. That means every single user, whether they're intentionally accessing data or not, is a potential insider threat risk to that information.
Well, I got to toss back to you another statistic from IBM this time, and they talk about 60% of all intrusions being insider threats. So we have people making mistakes and intentional.
Exactly. So it's not just the people inside the network that are intentionally accessing data. Once an attacker is inside the network, they can leverage their credentials. They can steal the access that you or anybody else has, which means every user inside needs to be monitored so that you understand how they're accessing data, and every user should only have access to what they're supposed to. Those can generally be very difficult things to do, which is why organizations are struggling.
Well, Brian, believe it or not, I used to take these security tests years ago. You'd sit in a room and multiple choice test and get your little certificate. And they always talked about firewalls. And I had to check back. We had a firewall. Hey, everyone's and there's application firewalls now. So firewall's the answer, right?
Firewall's the answer if you believe that all you need to do is just keep people out. Good fences are great, but once someone is inside the network, and what we're seeing over and over and over again, especially with these major breaches, is that if an attacker wants to get inside your network, your perimeter is not going to be enough. Your firewall is not going to be enough. No matter how much investment you make on a fence, once someone's inside, if you're not protecting the data itself, putting micro perimeters around that data and watching how it's being used, it's easy for someone to get in. And once they're in, they're going to get access to anything that they want.
Brian, we're here in the middle of Washington, D.C. We got to talk about the White House. In 2011, there was a presidential order making every agency take a look at insider threat for classified systems. And I don't know if that's enough.
I'm not sure that it's enough, but it's certainly something that every agency should be doing. They need to understand the roles of the people that have access to their data, and they need to make sure that they're monitoring every single user's behavior. Every one of these breaches tends to come down to people have access to too much, and we're not watching how they're actually accessing that data. So agencies need to be aware of who are your administrators, who are your actual users. Are administrators behaving badly? Are service accounts behaving badly? Are users, maybe by accident or even on purpose, accessing data in ways that might indicate that they've been compromised? If you're not looking at how that data is being used, it's impossible to catch when something goes wrong.
You just use the word behavior. I'm going to combine it with my word firewall. Is there such thing as a behavior firewall? Does that exist?
Yeah, behavioral firewalls absolutely do exist, and there's certainly advanced technology from a firewall perspective. But just like the traditional firewalls, organizations need to have defense in depth. And no matter how good your firewall is, it's not going to protect you from insider threats, since once somebody's inside, your firewall can't help you.
So spinning off on behavior here, I guess one could monitor behavior of people inside the wall, couldn't you?
You absolutely could. And when it comes to these kinds of attacks, when we're talking about attacks on data, the behavior that we're talking about isn't necessarily how the user interacts with the rest of the network. It's how does that user act on the data itself. So if we think of the data as an organizational asset and not like a laptop or a server or something else, but more like the money in a financial account, I guarantee you every agency keeps track of how its money is spent. Every agency needs to keep track of how its data is used. And the behavior that we're talking about is, are you recording how your files and emails are actually being accessed? Because you can't catch what you can't see. And if you can't see how people are accessing data, you're not going to be able to catch when something goes wrong.
I'm sure this is not true for our listeners, but there's reports that say, let's say Information Week reported that 95% of organizations have employees seeking to bypass security controls. Now, so you have the right controls, you have a good firewall, and guess what? People try to work around it, don't they?
People are going to do anything that they can to try to get their job done, and nobody wants to have technology get in their way. That said, if the controls are too strict that they can't get access to data that they want, they're going to let you know. What nobody's ever going to let you know and scream and yell is when they have access to too much information. People's jobs change. People are on projects. People get access to data that they need to do their jobs. Nobody ever calls up screaming and says, hey, I've got access to too much. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's a major problem too. I think you have to take a look at examining regular and privileged users, got to look at background, but maybe threat training might be involved in here too. You think there's part of it, or should it be automated?
No, absolutely. Automation is absolutely key, but training is a big part of what's going to keep our data safe. Users need to understand that every time that they access data, that's potentially risky. They need to understand that all the data that they have access to could potentially be very, very sensitive. Users need to understand the kinds of things that they shouldn't click on. They need to understand basic data security principles to help keep organizational assets safe.
So, Brian, I teach at Georgetown University. I just left the campus a half hour ago, and my last email is from the CIO of Georgetown saying, we have a problem with ransomware. Don't click on anything. So let's take a break and go back to ransomware and everyone's affecting, not only the federal government, everyone. We're going to pause here for a short break. My guest today is Brian Vecchi, technical evangelist at Varonis. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the discussion, Combating Insider Threat in Government, sponsored by Varonis on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.